Hello, my name is David Nolan, and I'm the host of Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. Today, I'm chatting with Cynthia Edwalds, the treasurer of SAGAA, the Sexuality and Gender Alliance of Actuaries. At this point, I want to alert listeners that during this podcast, there's discussion about suicide and suicidal ideation. Please remember that if you need any help, judgment-free support is available in the United States by calling 988. And now, on to my conversation with Cynthia Edwalds. Cynthia, welcome to Actuary Voices. I'm delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Great. I like to get a sense at the beginning about people's journey towards becoming an actuary. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yours.
So my journey, I was a math hotshot when I was in high school and knew I wanted to do something with math in my career. I figured that meant teaching, like at high school or university. And I heard the word actuary a couple times, but it was never in a very favorable context.
Okay.
I'll avoid trying to get in too deep into that side of it. Got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and I was working toward my PhD in math. And one of my very close friends, who got his master's the same time I did, left to get a job as an actuary. And my initial reaction was, so it's a good friend. I knew his wife had just gotten pregnant. I said, darn it, it's such a great career. And I understand you've got to get bread on the table now. And then he showed me how much actuaries got paid. I'm like, what? Where has this been all my life? So I decided to try some exams. And before I started my career, I passed 3 exams and had the master's on a bunch of credits toward my PhD. I did not finish the PhD. Once I started the actuarial career, it's like, oh, this is pretty good.
Right, good. Okay, so you became an actuary pretty soon after finishing your master's. And what type of actuary were you? What kind of work were you in?
I started on the P&C side. So my first job was at CNA, and after the rotation program, I did some general liability experience analysis. I went to workers' compensation reserving, and then from there to personal lines pricing. And then I got a job offer to go to a software firm that did only life and health. So I was getting close to my ACAS at the time, and so they agreed to pay for me to take one more chance at the one exam I needed to get my ACAS. And said after that, why don't you take life exams?
Oh,
So I did get the ACS on that try. I did get my ASA. I was there for about 5 years. So that was mostly life. That company was Polysystems. The next one was Combined Insurance. From there, I went to Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois, where I was doing health insurance for 6 years. And then to the Society of Actuaries as a research actuary before I came back to life insurance.
you really did run the gamut of all the different areas.
Well, yeah, when I was at the Society, I was doing some pension research too.
Wow, okay. And is there any particular experiences that you want to highlight?
Dave Holland, he had been the president of the Society of Actuaries. And when he gave his speech as a president-elect, I was just very impressed with how he made life insurance so personal, because it was personal for him. And he was saying, this is what we're doing. We're trying to make this kind of benefit available. His father had died young, and fortunately, there was life insurance to pay for him to go to college. And without that, he's not sure he would have been able to have the career he had. So that was something that made me feel good about being an actuary. I like to stay focused on that big picture. What are we trying to do here? I'm trying to make sure people can get the health care that they need and make that work financially, because it's really challenging to make sure there's enough money to pay for all the health care people need, and somehow they get that to flow through so that it's not overly burdensome to the member who's getting the care. And there's a lot of challenges being an actuary. But I think fundamentally, we're doing good for society. If we stay focused on that, we can all feel one on the side.
Yeah. Okay, well, you're here today because you're on the board of the Sexuality and Gender Alliance of Actuaries, and you're a transgender individual. And obviously, you've just mentioned data and the importance of getting access to the right data so that you can figure out the right insurance policies. I believe you've highlighted the lack of data around transgender men and women. I was wondering if you'd like to share a little bit about that.
So my own story is I chose the name Cynthia when I was 14. This has been with me my whole life. And I didn't tell a soul, not a single person, because it was like dangerous. Who would I tell and why? What would the upside of that be? Even if there was some kind of questionnaire about, gee, have you ever thought you should be a different gender? I was never going to answer that question. So it was over 50 years after I chose my name before I even was willing to talk to a therapist. Now that I'm, in addition to SAGAA, I'm also on the board of an organization that is a support group for mostly transgender women in their 60s, dealing with this for the first time. I struggled my whole life, but now I'm finally willing to talk about it. So for those of us in my generation, there's not going to be any data because nobody would admit to it. And we certainly don't know the ones who didn't make it. There's a huge suicide risk for transgender individuals. I actually attempted suicide once in my 20s. It's a struggle when you feel that you are just wrong. Once there was a better medical understanding of what this is, how it happens, and all that kind of stuff, there's ways to treat it. Like I said, the data is not going to be there for a very long time because really every story that I've heard, and I've heard maybe 100, the sense that there's a mismatch of some sort goes back to middle school or earlier. So those who are suffering gender dysphoria know it at an early age, and now we're able to talk to a healthcare provider and get professional counseling and sort it out and figure out where you are on the spectrum. That wasn't available. So that data is going to be hidden. If there was enough people who are coming out over age 65, we could look at effects for age 65, but I'm not sure that's really enough to understand what the mortality signature is.
And do you see moves in a positive direction about trying to overcome this issue?
Well, I've talked to parents of young trans people, and so the good thing is your children have supportive parents. I mean, not that I ever doubted that my parents loved me, but this was just simply unknown at the time. I mean, I figured if I said something to them, it was like, okay, residential treatment, whatever seemed to be necessary, but it wasn't like, yeah, you're transgender, and that's okay. So a lot of parents today are willing to recognize that their child is transgender when their child brings up something at conversations like, Mom, I feel like I'm a boy in a girl's body. That conversation usually starts there. From there we can determine how thorough it is. Because, it's not that particular comment doesn't necessarily mean that the child is transgender, but it certainly opens the question, and now it's understood well enough, especially in the mental health professions, so they can explore and determine what's the right approach.
So perhaps you could say a few words about how actuaries deal with populations where the data is not complete or present.
Well, right. So the first question is, what is the effect of the fact that data is missing? And how does it affect the insurance company? So the invisible populations, by and large, from the point of view of the insurance company, like, if there is transgender people on the insurance company's books and they don't know it, it's not a thing, really. First of all, they aren't really enough to move the needle. And, to the extent that the mortality is different, it may be, which is hard to say, but it may be not that much different. So particularly if you're in a socioeconomic group that buys life insurance, it certainly can be more dangerous if you're in a marginalized group already. But the other side of it is on the consumer side. Are there underwriting approaches or things like that are making it more difficult for people in the, I'll just say queer, which is what I've learned that the young people say, I'll say queer instead of LGBT. But for people in the queer community, there's something in the underwriting process that makes it more difficult to access life insurance and health insurance and any other kind of insurance. We would like to know that. And then one of the things that SAGAA is part of our mission is to try to remove those barriers, help companies or the industry, maybe not individual companies, but the industry to be aware of this particular thing is causing a barrier here that doesn't need to be there. I think one of the things that we've done as some presentations for the SOAs about HIV for a lot of companies, that's an automatic decline. Because treatment has advanced over the last 40 years, yeah, back in the mid 80s, the HIV positive diagnosis was almost a death sentence. So that was an issue on both sides. It was a tragedy for the person diagnosed, and from the insurance company's point of view, that made them no longer insurable. But now people can live. Just the mortality is slightly elevated, but it's not anything we wouldn't already underwrite as maybe a table 2 or something.
So you're saying that at the moment, the actuarial profession doesn't have a full picture of transgender men and women, but there's a roadmap. If we take an example, the transition that HIV has gone through over the last 40 odd years.
Right, right. Well, as somebody who suffered with gender dysphoria, there was nothing in my insurance applications in my 20s that would have indicated anything strange to an insurance. So the people that have undiagnosed gender dysphoria and untreated gender dysphoria, even if it's diagnosed, there's a higher risk of mortality. But if it's treated with gender affirming care, that mortality risk really, I think it actually reduces. Definitely lower than it was before the treatment, but even compared to what the estimated mortality would have been without the knowledge.
There's a broader conversation going on about the data that's being collected, and there have been some concerns raised that certain data sets are no longer continued. How does that impact your actuarial work?
Well, as actuaries, we love data. That's what we live on. It's our lifeblood. So any disruption to the stream of data is a sad event for actuaries. So the fact that some of these data sets have been discontinued is certainly problematic. One thing we do as a profession is we make estimates using the best data we can find, because a lot of times, especially when we're starting a new product or something, we're trying to make estimates when there isn't any data because this wasn't funded for. So we deal with it that way, to think of, well, okay, that data isn't there. We wish it were. It would make our lives so much easier, but what can we use if we don't have?
Let me take a moment to remind listeners that you're listening to Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. On this podcast, we talk to Academy volunteers and leaders, as well as friends of the Academy, about what inspires them about their work, both professionally or as a friend of or volunteer with the Academy. Please subscribe to Actuary Voices on your preferred podcast platform. And now, back to my conversation with Cynthia Edwalds, the treasurer of SAGAA, the Sexuality and Gender Alliance of Actuaries. Well, you have mentioned, and I've mentioned, the Sexuality and Gender Alliance of Actuaries. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the organization and the work you do.
Yeah, so SAGAA is one of 6 actuarial affinity groups, most of which started like in 2020. 2 that are older are the International Association of Black Actuaries, Organization of Latino Actuaries. But all of 6 are trying to do things to make it the actuarial profession more accessible to populations that have traditionally been underrepresented. Now, SAGAA is slightly different because it's not so much that there weren't queer actuaries, because they certainly were back when I started my career. Difference being that back then it had to be a big secret. If people actually found out, you actually could lose your job. So that has changed already. We're trying to make sure that young queer people know that this is a career option, because a lot of times, queer youth think they can't go into something in quite as straight laced, shall we say, as the actual profession. So make sure they know they're welcome. And then beyond that, to make sure that as their careers progress, that there aren't barriers, because there can be subtle barriers to career advancement, even if it's not as much as you're going to lose your job. It's just like the next promotion. So that's one thing we're working with, to try and make sure that we remove those barriers. But one of the things different about SAGAA than the other 5 is we're the only one that has a regulatory and advocacy arm, as far as I know. But we're looking at the impact of the work that actuaries do on queer populations everywhere. Things like the HIV underwriting, trying to bring a better knowledge to the industry about where there might be barriers to people accessing insurance products and employee benefits, where they need some additional knowledge to point out overall what the purpose of this insurance or benefit package is this. And you know what? The way it's written, it's making it difficult for queer people to get that same benefit.
And can you point to any specific progress you've made along those lines?
I know that our committee has had conversations with the Academy about the use of gender inclusive language in various ASOPs, had conversations with the NAIC about gender inclusive language and regulation. I think we've had some progress too, but certainly we've had the conversations.
Right. And just for folks who may not know, ASOPs are Actuarial Standards of Practice, and the NAIC is the National Association of Insurance Commissioners.
Thank you.
You've mentioned that SAGAA is aiming to get more queer people into the actuarial profession. Are there any specific projects or initiatives that you'd like to talk about that will help that?
Our scholarship program is one that's directly related for college students who are either queer or queer allies. So the allies are extremely important, and we don't want to exclude them in any way, just like we don't want to be excluded either. We do offer scholarships, which help students know that they're welcome, that they have friends on the other side. That's probably our primary one at this point.
Right. And more generally, SAGAA is looking to make people feel at ease in the profession?
Well, yes, we do some networking things. I mean, when we know there's in a particular geographic area, like in New York, Minneapolis, we'll have little mixers, but we do also do some online things where just, people can, dial in and just have a chat. It's, just always good to know that you have friends. There's people who understand what you're going through and can relate to the challenges that you're facing, whatever they are.
Sure. And as you mentioned, SAGAA is not exclusively for queer men and women, it is for allies as well.
Right, right.
And is there anything else you'd like to tell us about SAGAA?
Well, that we exist. We have a member platform, and becoming a member is free. We're open not only to people who are queer, but queer allies, which are hugely important, actually, across all the spectrum. Allies are really important to, make sure that there is integration. You can go to our website, so SAGAActuaries.org. There's a link there to sign up for our member list.
Great. Thank you. So, one of the questions I like to ask Cynthia is what people like to do for fun.
So I have to say that I do love to do math puzzles. There's the American Mathematical Society publishes a calendar every year, the math puzzle for every day of the year. People like to do those every day. Things that are maybe less common in my actuaries, I love to sing. I'm in church choir, and I've done some tour groups that have choirs as part of them. And I love to do karaoke. If anybody's going for karaoke, just let me know. I'll be with there.
Excellent. And I hope you know that our magazine Contingencies has a series of puzzles at the back.
Yes, which is why I said just obviously actuaries love puzzles.
Right. So we've started something new with the podcast this year, in that we ask each guest to leave a question for the next guest. And our last guest was the Academy president, Tricia Matson. And she asked, what suggestion do you have for Academy leadership on how they can better serve our members and provide value?
Yeah, actually, I think the Academy is already doing most of these things, but certainly working with the affinity groups, all 6 of us, to make sure that the concerns of each of these populations that have traditionally been underrepresented in the actual profession have a clear path and have the support of the Academy and advancing in their careers and having the right tools for doing the work that they need to do, which is what the Academy has been doing all along.
Yes, and we are committed to continuing that work, I can assure you. So thank you for that. And now it's your turn. Do you have a question for our next guest? What would you like to ask?
I would like to know what progress is being made toward research on queer population for both mortality and morbidity. What have we done so far? What more can we learn about whatever nuances there are to the risks?
Great. Thank you very much. You've been listening to my conversation with Cynthia Edwalds, the treasurer of SAGAA, the Sexuality and Gender Alliance of Actuaries. And please remember that if you need counseling or help, judgment-free support is available in the United States by calling 988. My name is David Nolan, and I'm the host of Actuary Voices, the podcast from the American Academy of Actuaries. Please visit our website, actuary.org, for a wealth of information about the work that the Academy does, including all of our work on artificial intelligence. You can follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn as well. And of course, please subscribe to this podcast on your preferred podcast platform.